Ukraine doesn't have as many soldiers as it needs to keep up its defenses against Russia. Now it's enlisting prisoners to fill the gap. DW correspondent Max Zander met with convicts-turned-soldiers going to the front lines in exchange for freedom.
Not long ago, these men were considered a danger to society, locked up for often violent crimes. Now, they're being trained to kill.
Let's go attack.
Turning criminals into soldiers is Ukraine's latest attempt to fill the ranks and hold back the Russians. And they are said to have certain advantages.
These boys are already hardened by life. There's a concept of what honor and dignity are. Therefore, these guys have a lot of motivation. Maybe when they go to serve as soldiers, they make good soldiers.
All of them serve time in prison, including their instructor. He was a soldier in the Donbas War before being sentenced to 8 years for aggravated battery. He served 5.5 and got early release in return for rejoining the military.
Man, I showed you before. You need to lean on with your helmet.
As a fellow convict, Viktor knows where these recruits come from. As a soldier, he also knows where they're headed next. Now he is passing on what he learned fighting in the trenches: technique and resilience.
I will never believe that a person has no fear. No matter how professional a warrior you are, there's always fear. You just need to be able to control it, that's all. It's just adrenaline.
Ihor is just 23. He spent the last 5 years, his entire adult life, in jail.
There's nothing for me to do in prison. I ended up there out of stupidity. I was young, I got into a fight, and I ended up in prison.
Volunteering was never about redeeming himself, he tells us, but about having a purpose in life and protecting others.
I have no fear at all. Back in 2014, I was in Donetsk. My grandmother lived there, and terrible things happened right in front of me. Right now, I feel ready to go, but I know that this feeling might change on the battlefield.
We're interrupted. We just had to stop the interview. The instructor shouted, "Take cover," and now we're taking cover underneath these trees here. That is because we're still very close to the front line, and it seems that a drone may be here in the area looking for Ukrainian troops. It turns out this was a FPV, a Russian suicide drone. Something they will have to get used to. This time, though, it didn't hit. Using prisoners to fight the war was long frowned upon here in Ukraine. The Russians began recruiting in prisons early on. Many ended up as cannon fodder.
The use is completely different, how theirs and ours work, and there's a big difference in terms of provisions, fulfillment of all tasks, and the time and preparation that are allocated for each task.
The Ukrainian prisoners are being given the same training as other recruits. Some say they seem to adapt faster and show more motivation than the average civilian.
They're less capricious, to some extent, accustomed to survival, to independence in general, and they don't rely on anyone else. The fact that they've lived in a collective also plays a role.
Some of them left prison just months early, others years. Like most soldiers, these men will serve until the end of the war, or until they're disabled or killed, whichever comes first. We meet with men recovering from combat injuries.
I called him Lavender. He's as loyal as a person.
Any support, it seems, is welcome.
I suffered a concussion and lost 17% of my vision. I'm completely deaf in one ear. It happened a month ago. I'll go back to the fight.
Ivan is a father of 5. He's a veteran of the war in Donbass.
Personally, I want my children to live in a free state, in a free country, and not as slaves under some incomprehensible master.
He was jailed for aggravated robbery.
10 years imprisonment with confiscation of property. I served 7 years and had 3 left. I understand it wasn't worth it. I wasn't keeping the right company. I didn't have the right friends.
Now he's a military driver. Ruslan was hit by shrapnel and is recovering. He did time for theft and fraud. Now he is fighting.
I've changed, but I don't even want to talk about what's happening at the front. With such a situation, the Russians advance and advance, and it's not known what will happen. We tried to do something to stop it. You can't stop all of them, but at least some of them.
These convicts are taking big risks for their freedom. But many seem to think it's a way to leave old mistakes behind and change the course of their lives.
And DW correspondent Max Zander, who filed the report you just saw, joins me now at the table. Max, Ukraine now having to recruit prisoners is really a sign of how difficult it's becoming for the army to enlist people to join the fight. Just how bad is the situation?
Well, Christine, I mean, this can be seen as one of many indicators that the situation is very serious. Now, the Russians very early on in the war started recruiting heavily in their prisons. And in Ukraine for a long time it was seen as immoral, like a Russian thing to do. The Ukrainians wanted to stay away from this. So it took until this year, in May, that the Rada in Kyiv, the Ukrainian parliament, finally passed a bill that would allow the military to recruit from prisons on a voluntary basis. Now, the situation has become like this because there simply aren't as many volunteers, certainly not in the numbers that we've seen at the beginning of the war, where you had long lines of volunteers lining up outside the recruitment centers. Some of them were sent away because the authorities were overwhelmed, didn't know what to do with them. More than 2.5 years into the war now, the situation has changed. Ukraine has began mobilizing. Ukraine has started to ramp up its mobilization. Right now, they're looking into mobilizing another 160,000 soldiers. But Ukraine is also a small country, and you cannot draw endlessly from the population. Yeah. It's very, very difficult. So they have to look left and right. What else can we do? And one of the solutions they come up with is this: to look at the prisons, and they saw, okay, there are men here who would fit the criteria, who are willing to fight. So let's recruit them.
And on that criteria, how are the Ukrainians prisoners, one, being selected, and two, being prepared to fight?
Right, so you have recruiters from the military going to the prisons, to the penal institutions in the entire country. You have prisoners applying to this program through their prisons. Now, a court has to decide whether or not this prisoner is eligible to apply to join this program based on certain criteria. There are certain crimes that some of the prisoners would have committed that would exempt them. For example, multiple murder, rape, driving under the influence, causing an accident, and there's a very long list of that. Once they're able to apply, they are being brought as prisoners to the recruitment centers. They receive a medical like every other soldiers. Yeah. They do the paperwork, and then they are brought to the training facilities where they're being trained. At this point, they are soldiers, just like their peers who come from civilian life. Right. With the differences that they are on probation. They have probation. If they desert, 5 to 10 years are added to their sentence, but they receive the same training and the same salary as everybody else. The difference is that during their first year of being in the force, they do not have their annual leave, but the rest is the same.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that Russia's been doing this for a while now. Are there any differences with how the Russian armed forces are using these former prisoners and how the Ukrainian armed forces are?
Absolutely. Huge differences. Now, the Russians have been doing this aggressively since the very beginning of the war. recruiting for the Wagner mercenary group back then, but also for the regular armed forces. Russia has a huge prison population, more than 400,000 people, so they can recruit a lot of soldiers and pay them incentives like high salaries. They can also grant them freedom after 6 months, which has been done in the beginning of the war with the Wagner mercenary group, for example. The soldiers the soldiers, former convicts in Russia, are used in a very different way than the Ukrainians are planning or using their soldiers. They are usually not trained properly. They are brought to the fight very quickly, and they are used. They're disposable, essentially. They're being used oftentimes in a meat grinder tactic, which means soldiers are being sent to storm Ukrainian positions knowingly that 80% of them are not going to survive. Then they send in the next wave and the next wave, just because they're able to get so many new soldiers there. The Ukrainians, on the Ukrainian side, it's a little bit different. Their prison population is much smaller. It was less than 50,000 at the beginning of the war. And they are lacking soldiers, so they have to be very, very careful, and they have to give them the best chances to survive. So the best training they can give them, the best training they can afford, dedicate time to this, and also use them in a reasonable manner. Also, the Ukrainian former prisoners are not being used they're fighting alongside regular Ukrainian forces and not in penal brigades, for example.
Understood. Well, Max, let's leave it there for the moment. But as always, thank you for that incredible reporting, giving us that insight into this experience you had visiting that training camp and talking to these men. That's DW's Max Zander there for us. Thank you, Max.